Hello, my name is Elliot Walker, and today I would like to complete an external analysis of the pharmaceutical industry. Now, to start, it would be helpful to understand what the pharmaceutical industry is. Well, as we know, it is a group of companies that engage in the research and development of drugs and also the production of drugs. These companies are both public and private, and within the market, there's even a bit of a split in that some companies focus on research, development, and production of those drugs, and other companies focus simply on producing generic drugs after a patent has expired. So, with that in mind, let's take the chance to analyze the five forces of this industry and hopefully walk away with a better understanding of what's going on within the industry. So for starters, let's look at the threat of new entrants. And I rank this as relatively low. And you might ask, why is that? Let's talk about it. Part of this is because there is a large investment required to develop, to research, and to eventually produce these drugs. For firms that especially focus on that aspect of the market, it requires a lot of investment, a lot of time, and a lot of patience to eventually receive the return on that investment. And that can ultimately dissuade companies from entering the market. Beyond that, there are also strict and precise regulatory controls that firms must understand. And simply taking the time to research, to understand, and to eventually implement those regulations can take a lot of manpower, a lot of time, and ultimately a lot of money. And that also can push firms away from entering this strict market. But it's not all bad news. There are some opportunities for firms to enter, and that is for firms that want to focus on producing generic drugs. These are firms who enter the market after a firm has lost a patent for a specific drug. These new firms enter with the hopes of producing a generic drug at a lower cost to hopefully profit off the opportunity. So with all of that in mind, I believe the threat of new entrants can be ranked as relatively low. Now let's move on to the next, and that would be the bargaining power of suppliers. And that I've ranked to be moderately low. And let's talk about why I think that is. For starters, the raw materials needed to produce these drugs and medications is very complex. The industry requires and relies on suppliers to be very precise, to be very timely, and to be very accurate. It's hard to simply shop around and choose the lowest option as a firm in the industry. Instead, you've really got to focus on the quality and the trustworthiness of what's being supplied to you. So in that way, the suppliers do have some bargaining power. But it's also important to understand the scope of what's happening. Even though the suppliers must make a very important piece of the puzzle, they are very, very small compared to the immense size of the firms in the industry. Firms like AstraZeneca and Pfizer are immense compared to these much smaller suppliers. So with all that in mind, I believe we can understand the bargaining power of suppliers to really be moderately low because of just how big and immense these industry partners are. Now let's move on to the bargaining power of buyers. And this I've ranked to be moderate, just about in the middle. And let's see why that is. Well, for starters, we must understand that the buyers of the industry are typically quite large and they have a lot of buying power. These can be governments, these can be hospitals, and these can even be insurance groups. The amount of product they buy represents a very large amount, and with that, there's a lot of spending power that they can use to attain some leverage and hopefully some bargaining tokens. That's one part of the puzzle to understand. But moving forward, it's also important to see that the introduction of the internet and the implementation of online shopping and online visibility allows these buyers to look online and understand what pricing ought to be and what it is for certain drugs, and they can use that to benchmark that against what they're hoping to buy from other firms. So this also provides a sort of bargaining token for buyers because they know what a price should be. It can use that to leverage what they're being offered by a current industry partner. But there is one thing to remember from the industry, and that would be when a firm focuses on R&D and they develop a new, innovative, and important drug, they have great power to charge what they want for that drug if there's a need. Because they have been innovative and they're the first to market for that drug, they kind of set the price tag on what firms have to pay to get to use that drug. And when these governments, when these hospitals, when these insurance groups need that for their clients, they're not going to have much bargaining power to get a better price. They're going to pay what the industry says they must pay. So with all of that working together and considering it all together, I believe we can understand the bargaining power of buyers to really be moderate, just about in the middle. Now let's move on to the threat of substitutes. And I've also decided to consider this as moderates, and let me explain why that is. For starters, there is an increasing trend towards alternative medicine. When a consumer needs treatment, the common thought is, well, let me get you a prescription for a drug or a different treatment that you can use to solve your problems. But in recent years, and growing more so each year after that, there has been a movement towards using things like yoga or medication or acupuncture or many things like that to treat pain, to treat anxiety, to treat other issues. And those things replace, they substitute the use of drugs and treatments from within the pharmaceutical industry. And that represents a bit of a threat of substitution, which is not good if you are a member of the pharmaceutical industry. Looking further, there has also been a trend from consumers to focus more on well-being and health, and that means looking to get more exercise, more activity, and even an improved diet into your daily life. And all of those efforts can hopefully help you become a more healthy, happy person. And people who are happy and healthy tend to use fewer drugs and medications. So that also can detract from the profit that could be going to the pharmaceutical industry. But we must temper that with an understanding that there will always be, for the foreseeable future, a dependence on drugs and medicine. We can do our best to use yoga and meditation and activity and diet, but at the end of the day, if you need amoxicillin, you need amoxicillin. And drugs and treatments like that are going to exist for a very long time, and because of that, there's always going to be a need for the pharmaceutical industry moving forward, at least for the foreseeable future. So when we consider all of that, I believe we can say the threat of substitutes is moderate. And finally, let's consider the competitive rivalry within the pharmaceutical industry. And this, for obvious reasons, is very relatively high. And let me tell you why I think that is. For starters, when a patent expires, it opens the floodgates for new firms to create a generic drug. And the firm who created the patent no longer has exclusive rights over the production of that drug. That can clearly and obviously produce a very hectic, a very competitive environment to profit off that treatment. Further, before a drug has been patented, before it's been finished, there's intense rivalry to be the first to produce it, the first to finish, and the first to get to market. So firms can often compete against each other to finish producing a treatment that can receive a patent and go to market. Further, in recent years, there's been an increased use of AI in the development of drugs. This has required less manpower, less investment, and overall a net good when it works. But because of that, there's an even increased amount of tension and competition for firms to be able to use it best, to be able to use it most efficiently, and ultimately go to market first and capitalize on the returns of being the first to have a patent. But with that in mind, we must also remember there's still growth occurring in the industry, and this helps to temper the competitive rivalry caused by other factors. Over the next 5 years, there's an estimated annual growth rate of about 5%. So when we understand that, we can see that that can alleviate some of the stress and some of the intense, bitter rivalry within the market. So with all of that in mind, I believe the competitive rivalry is ultimately relatively high. Now, I mentioned a growth figure. Let's look at some more financial data within the market. For starters, in 2025, the estimated industry revenue globally is expected to be $1,027 billion, a severely large number. And like I mentioned previously, the compound annual growth rate is expected to be about 5% over the next 5 years. And for firms operating in the market, there is about a 20% net profit margin across the industry, a very strong, very firm number for firms who can make it and stay in the industry. Now finally, I've said a lot of things. Let's discuss some closing threats and opportunities for firms who are in the industry, for the industry as a whole. For starters, let's look at the threats. The first one that stands out is the threat of a patent expiring. When a patent expires, a firm loses exclusive rights to produce and sell a drug, and it opens up opportunities for other companies to get involved and to ultimately dilute and water down the ability for the original firm to make profit. And that then creates intense competition and even threatens the original firm who came to market with that drug. Further, there's also a threat of alternative medicine starting to chip away at the market share of the pharmaceutical industry. Consumers who use alternative medicine are looking for ways to replace the pharmaceutical industry. And if that is to grow in the coming years, the pharmaceutical industry ought to be concerned. Further, the changes in regulations from the UK and the US in recent years have aims to create a more transparent industry and a greater ability to monitor and adjust what's happening in the industry from a government perspective. This is very problematic if you are a member of the pharmaceutical industry. More government involvement, more transparency, and ultimately more awareness of what you're doing is typically not going to be a good thing if you are a member of the pharmaceutical industry. But let's not end on a negative note. Let's look at some positives. What are the opportunities for growth if you are in the markets? The first would be the trend towards preventative care. Now, you might think that's a threat, right? That's taking away from the pharmaceutical industry. And in the short term, it could be. But I believe in the long term, that is an opportunity for the industry to meet where consumers want to be. Consumers have shown interest in shifting towards preventative treatment and care before having to dose drugs and treatments for an ailment. If the industry can help to understand this and meet customers where they want to be, they can hope to diversify and create new parts of their offerings that help to meet customer needs and help to provide treatments that can be used ahead of time before an ailment occurs. And then finally, a great opportunity is the use of AI and the increased deployment of AI in research and development. We've seen in a small sample size what it can do to reduce time, effort, and investment behind R&D, but I believe it is a strong candidate to help firms experience continued growth while also reducing costs and personnel that might have been required in the past. So with all this in mind, I think I've helped to share a greater understanding of what's happening in the pharmaceutical industry and what will be happening in the future. And with that, that's all I got.